Session here. Hi, everybody. Okay, so I recognize several of you in the room, and I'm sure you're thinking, is he going to talk about the same stuff again? No, I want to try and do a little spin on publication ethics today and actually think about some issues that you might not think were obviously ethical. And by show of hands, how many of you actually work at a publisher? Okay, so about 2/3 of the room. So what I want to try and do is actually show how these actually have a relevance to you as a publisher. Okay, so first of all, there's my conflict of interest statement. I think every presentation should start with one of these. And I put that in a large font so you could actually read it as well. Okay, so there's going to be three things that I'm going to focus on today. Very, very quickly, just going to go over a couple of definitions, and no, I'm not going to define what's plagiarism and all of that. But we will just quickly go over some definitions. Then I'm going to look at three areas of a nuanced interpretation of what we may understand as publication ethics, or at least how you, particularly as publishers, can respond to these issues. And then just finally, again, a couple of thoughts on how publishers can help editorial offices. My background is a former publisher, but I also work in editorial offices. I'm very acutely aware of what your pressures are as a publisher. I'm also very acutely aware of what editors are actually saying, and what they say to you might not be actually what they're saying amongst themselves, okay? If they're indeed communicating on these issues with you at all. Okay, so typically misconduct can be broken down into two areas. There's research misconduct, which is falsification, fabrication, unethical research, and then there's the publication side. Just very quickly, scientific misconduct could be defined as follows. That's from the Office of Research Integrity. And of course, that's a major issue. That's often institutions have to get involved to deal with that. A journal typically would not just in isolation handle falsification and fabrication issues, okay? But we're going to look at publication, okay? I would say in the last few years there's incredible awareness now of publication ethics issues. When I started work at Headache, the very first thing I ever asked the editor was, where's our conflict of interest policy? And he goes, what's that? And that was 2004, sorry. So not to say that that was an unethical journal, that was fairly typical, as I discovered. So things have come a long way since then, and obviously COPE can probably claim the biggest credit for that. But other organizations are involved, and most of them align on many of these issues. These are predominantly in the clinical medical area. I think clinical medicine has led the charge on this. It's not to say that other fields are not doing that. Most of Origin's journals, actually, that's my company, are physics journals, and I know that in physics these discussions are now happening. There's also lots of individual publisher guidelines. I didn't realize there were so many. There was a couple that were familiar to me, but a point I'm going to return to later. I actually do work with 7 different publishers, and I will tell you now that only one of them has actually ever sent those guidelines to me. And in the process of putting this slide together, I actually realized that 3 of them had publication ethics guidelines. I never even knew they existed. Excuse me. Where's the arrow disappeared? There we go. Okay, so these are the common ethical concerns that we all know about. I don't think there's anything there that's shocking or new to you. There's a slide I was going to include, but I didn't in the end, where it talks about the degrees of unethicalness that Liz Wager put together, which is a lovely little slide, although she did confess that it was just based on opinion rather than actual empirical data. But there are, so obviously intent is some degree behind these things, but these are all ethical issues that every typical journal has to deal with, sadly, on a more common basis. And of course, you can break some of these down into ethicalness related to authors, ethicalness related to reviewers, and ethicalness related to editors. Some of these areas overlap. I think every single one of us has potential conflicts of interest, and we let those get in the way. I've seen some pretty horrible things done by all 3 of these stakeholders at some point or another. And I think the critical one's the one in the middle there, abuse of trust. Peer review is predicated on trust. If we can't trust what we read, if we can't trust the process, the whole thing is one giant fraud. We can't believe anything, okay? All right, so this is the meat of the presentation. I want to look at 3 particular areas, and I'm going to go over those now with you. and they are a failure to conduct full and fair peer review, and the implications of that, the accountability in the correcting of the literature, and really what I'm talking about there is that there are editors floundering out there. Even though there's all these resources out there, they do not understand what they're supposed to do with it all. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about predatory journals. And I don't want to focus on the obvious thing. We all know that they're a scam. Okay? What I want to focus on is that how individual journals themselves, proper journals, non-predatory journals, can respond to what's happening. And I'll give you an example of actually something that just popped up in my email box yesterday. So can publishers get involved and handle these more nuanced issues? I argue, I think you can and you should. I think you have a moral responsibility to do so. Okay, so first of all, what is peer review supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to provide expert opinion. I would like to say that all journals do that. I know for a fact that quite often journals are scrambling to find reviewers, and they'll take any name that they can. We all know about the fake reviewer rings, authors acting as reviewers for their own work. So clearly that's not happening in a way that it should be. Research is supposed to be presented in a properly contextualized manner and within the established literature of the field. We expect that when people review a paper that they actually understand where that paper fits in the great scheme of things. Again, that's why you need expert reviewers. The most critical thing of all is that we want people to validate the results. That means that they need to be able to say, yes, these results are actually as accurate as we know science to be, okay? That the methods that were conducted were the best that could have been applied to get the results that they say that they've got. That point about replication there, that's all tied into that. And this is what, when, as Adam mentioned, the work I do with the Equator Network, is that there needs to be, no matter whether it's physics, biology, clinical medicine, in the methods section, there needs to be enough pertinent information for, one, peer reviewers to actually interpret those results that they were actually, what they said they were going to do, the results actually are showing that, and also that the results could properly be derived from those methods. And secondly, that readers can go away and replicate the study. Science is based on replication. If we cannot replicate, then it's a complete waste of time. We've just published 3-4 pages of absolute garbage if we can't actually do anything with it. Okay? I might as well have just written that with my non-scientific background. That's as much value as it has. Peer review is supposed to perform a gatekeeper role as well. Now, this is what most reviewers get obsessed about, okay? They don't give us all the wonderful bits of text about this is how you can polish up your paper, these are the things that you're missing. Instead, they just want to give us the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and they're obsessed with that. And that's an important role, but it's only a minor role compared to giving us comments, your expert opinion. Ultimately, the gatekeeper role, that's the editor that knows what they want to do with the paper, because they know about their page budgets, they know about what they want to do. If they want to raise their impact factor, they're going to reject more of this type of paper. But peer reviewers get obsessed with that. Anyway, so they're supposed to do all of these things. And journals have an obligation to a variety of stakeholders to deliver all of this full and fair peer review. Does this happen? Apparently not. Okay? There are legions of stories at this point about failure of peer review, and this is probably one of the most classic ones of all with Vioxx and the New England Journal of Medicine. But really, this is a classic case of people not having all the information in front of them, the reviewers that is, to really properly judge the paper, and it gets waved through. Maybe there's other reasons. I'm not going to stand up here and incriminate myself by making allegations, but some people may speculate as to why this got through the way it did. Reviewers routinely supply summary reviews. This is another reason why apparently there is a failure to conduct full peer review. I'm sure if any of you have ever worked in an editorial office, you dread the fact that you've got 2 reviewers and both of them come back saying, yep, this is good enough to publish. That's it. That's your review. And you've just waited 2 weeks for that. It's a nightmare when you get that. That's a complete failure of peer review right there. Again, we probably could have done that. Reviewers often accept the invitation to review without the requisite experience. I don't know why, but some people feel pressurized into accepting the opportunity to do a review just because we sent them an email. If you can't do it, don't do it. I always advise reviewers that when I give them training. But there's a problem when people that aren't qualified to review a paper are doing this. And again, I'm going to tie this all back into why should publishers care? Isn't this what editors care about? No, you should care. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So editors knowingly override reviewer concerns. So it's not just the reviewers that are the problem, the editors too. I've seen many times where editors fly in the face of what the reviewers are telling them. And again, there could be an agenda behind that. It could be a commercial agenda, because they know it's going to generate reprint sales, that paper. It could be a political agenda. It could be an intellectual agenda. What happens is that so often authors don't include enough information for us to replicate the study, okay? They do poor reporting of what they've done. But then we exacerbate the problem in editorial offices by failing to conduct full peer review. And so what happens is that we end up with Altman and Lang diagnosed, is that we have these dozens of studies that have been published looking at peer review, and every one has found that large proportions of articles contain error in the application, analysis, interpretation, or reporting of statistics, or in the design or conduct of research. Again, this goes back to the point that most research that we publish is absolute rubbish, quite frankly. It does not stand up to full methodological interrogation. And we're failing miserably in detecting this, because so many people just wade through papers. And there are consequences to this. There are huge consequences to this. So if you're a researcher, one of the worst things is that you sent up a cul-de-sac. You know, somebody said all of this over here, and it's patently wrong or false, and everyone goes in that direction. And then somebody eventually realizes this is a dead end. If you work in the clinical medicine area, this can have negative outcome on patient, negative impact on patient outcomes. That's a problem right there. That affects all of us. We're all patients. The whole fields have to go back and start all over again. Content domains require new research. So, a failure to consistently conduct proper peer review is an ethical transgression in my mind. If we particularly, again, if you work in certain areas where there are major implications beyond that, clinical medicine is a classic one, if we really letting stuff through, that could have an effect on patients down the road. That's a problem. I argue about waste as well. A lot, you are taxpayers, you fund research, and we're waving through research that the government has funded, and nobody's checked that. They don't check it. The NIH doesn't go back and check a lot of this stuff. They don't check it for accuracy and validate it. Journals are the outlet for that material, and if we're not checking it properly, we've just kind of wasted all that research. I mean, we've let people get away with wasting our tax dollars. Even though anyone that always says, as a taxpayer, I always get worried when somebody says that. I know that I'm going to hear something outrageous that's going to follow that statement, but hopefully mine wasn't too outrageous. Okay, so though intent may shape the perceived seriousness of the problem, we should no longer tolerate ignorance as an excuse. What I mean by that is that it's no good saying, well, I didn't really understand that this is what we were supposed to do as a reviewer, or I didn't really understand what we were supposed to do as an editor, okay? This can't continue. We can't continue down this road. Training is needed for editors and editorial office staff on the ethical obligations on performing or ensuring proper peer review. They get none of that right now, okay? I might talk to my editors a little bit about these are the things you need to be aware of. And I'm not just talking about how to detect plagiarism and all that stuff. I'm talking about these are your responsibilities. When you make a decision on the paper, it's not just about which issue that's going to go in next. It's about what are the implications when you publish that piece of research right there. And are you confident that you've done everything you can to make sure it's proper and valid? Okay? Publishers can play a role. You can educate stakeholders on what they need to do. And I actually see some publishers starting to do that now. I see some resources out there, and I think that they're good. I think they're still, by necessity, somewhat generic. And so what I would like to see is that publishers could actually do a couple of things. One is, right now, I know of research that's going on up in Ottawa with David Mower's group, the Journalology group, the University of Ottawa and the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. They are doing research right now into reviewer core competencies. These are the things that every reviewer should know about before they undertake a review. Now, of course, every journal is going to have very specific instructions, but there are some fundamental things that, as a reviewer, that you should know. Now, nobody's ever measured that, certainly not at an academic level. So that's going to be important research when that comes out. They're also doing some on editor core competencies. And what I would love to see, and I know that David and his group are talking to some publishers right now, but I would love to see if publishers could all get together and support that kind of research. I know PERE in Europe right now, I don't know if that's how they pronounce it, P-E-E-R-E. They're looking at this conversation, they're having this conversation too. What are the core things that we should be doing in peer review? Okay? I am a little concerned that each publisher will come up with their own program, and that's just going to lead to confusion. People would rather just have a standard set of things that they could refer to, okay? Now, that's not to say that every publisher then has to put the same thing out there. I think you can have these core things, and then if you want to window dress it, that's great too. I think that publishers could insist that editors ensure a minimum standard of peer review is attempted and hopefully achieved, okay? And that you plan to review obligations and individual plans to deliver full and fair peer review at each journal that you publish, okay? I think if you're a publishing manager, that's a perfectly legitimate conversation for you to have. Certainly if you're a publisher that owns that journal, I think you should be having that conversation. But if you say you publish on behalf of a society, I think that's a conversation that you can have and nobody gets offended. I mean, I wouldn't say you talk at them, I think you have a conversation. But you want to make sure that they are on the same page. Now, I can tell you that because Origin has one particular account where we work with 16 different editors, and there is a lot of unification of policy, but I will tell you now that sometimes one or two of those editors starts to go in a different direction. All 16 are supposed to be going in the same direction. So why should publishers get involved? Well, the potential for embarrassment when problems are exposed is huge. So if something blows up at one of your journals, you're going down with that ship, okay? Your name is, you know, unfortunately the larger the publisher, the bigger the target, but you know, the media doesn't distinguish any difference between you and that journal if you're a publisher. Many editors work in isolation. They're clamoring for education on these matters. If you can help with that, that's great, if you can educate them. And you can add a measure of consistency as well, which will actually help you in the long run because there's less work if everyone's, you know, marching to the same beat. And now you might just think, is this his opinion? No, this just came out in Nature this month, that apparently 80% of respondents to the survey that Nature conducted on this reproducibility crisis actually felt funders and publishers have a role to play in this. They didn't actually say what that role should be, but they felt publishers should be involved. Well, you have a position to publicize, educate, and even impose steps. Okay, so very quickly, because I want to move on, I don't want to take up Deborah's time. The second issue is responding to ethical transgressions. Most journals typically do a bunch of things. They go look at COPE, what they have to say. They may have their own ethics committee. They often consult with the publisher. There's a lot of problems that they struggle with. They don't know what to do. They're paranoid that they're going to get sued, and they feel crippled by that. If you're a small journal, and I've worked on small journals, you can write to authors, and authors just feel like they can ignore you because you're a tiny little title and it doesn't matter. It's different if JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine came knocking at your door, then that might be a little more alarming. And that there is this issue of also society politics as well. A lot of editors can be compromised by politics within a society, and so I'm going to have another spin on this. Can publishers help? Well, yes, they can. So what can publishers do? Well, they can educate and encourage application of best practice. Well, first of all, you saw those publishers that have got their guidelines out there. Make sure that you sit down and have a conversation with every one of your editors and go through that guideline and say, you can have your own policy at this journal. You don't have to follow ours. But here's some things that we think that you should be doing fundamentally so. You need to talk to them about why these issues are important. You'll be surprised. It's obvious to us because we talk about these things, but it's not to other people. If their primary job is to operate on somebody's knee, they might not be thinking about publication ethics issues, okay? So why bother? Well, for the journals you publish under licenses is a critical service. If you own them, like I said, you need to be aware of these things. You can actually enhance your reputation. Some fields are pretty small. If they can see that a publisher is really working to help them, make sure that everything's clean and fair, then that only makes you look good. Okay, the third and final one that I just wanted to dwell on, predatory journals. Okay, so we all know that they're a problem, but there is a major insidious thing that's creeping in and that is that stuff is that there's thousands of articles out there now, and people can't researchers are not distinguishing that these are coming from predatory journals, okay? There's no peer review at pretty much all of these predatory journals, and what's happening is that somebody's going to come along and conduct a systematic review and just take this paper and this paper and this paper from some bogus predatory journal, and suddenly all the fake data or unpeer-reviewed material in there is elevated and it appears in the systematic review. Once again, we're going off down that scientific cul-de-sac. This is a real problem. Now, again, you might think, well, who takes responsibility for this, okay? So I think obviously as publishers, we need to be worried about that. I think our journals individually need to be worried about that. And one of the ways that we need to worry about that is that we may need to have policies on citation in the future. Okay, but I'm looking at this going, how the heck am I, as a managing editor, going to police for this? How am I going to go? Am I going to go through every single citation and see that it was in a predatory journal? I may have to, but it'd be helpful if there was other solutions. I don't have the answers to this, by the way. I'm just bringing this point up. But the issue is huge. This is not going to go away. We need to address it. There's implications for research. Okay, there's also. There's also another issue, and that is spoofing. Okay. Now I just had to write an editorial in the journal Headache because I now have 2 journals. I knew of one, found out another one yesterday. That's effectively using my journal title to sucker people in. In fact, one of my editorial board members said, well, because he's now on my editorial board, he wasn't at the time, he wrote to me about a year ago and said, when do I start? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he'd signed up for a predatory journal. And this guy's at Yale. And, he's now, so they love this. They've got a Yale professor now on their editorial board. So anyway, I think that what I would like to see you maybe do as publishers is go to editors, educate them a little bit on these other concepts of predatory publishing, the concerns and the implications for you. Talk about what I've just said. Watch out for people spoofing you. Maybe help them devise some citation policies once you've figured it out what the solutions to these things might be. Warn them that there's an implication of evidence inflation. In my editorial, which came out in Headache, I also talked about how you as a reader can identify that you're looking at a predatory publication, okay? So I would argue that as publishers, try and get this message out there. So finally, I've got 2 slides to go, and they're summaries. So consider how best that you can raise awareness of your own ethical policies and ensure that they are executed in a widespread manner, okay? Don't just publish it on the internet and then leave it there. A lot of your editors probably don't even know it exists, okay? And develop a twin education implementation plan. So do 2 things. Individually discuss with your editors, what are you going to do at this journal? What's your ethical policy? But at another level, maybe look at providing educational resources for authors, for editors, for reviewers, and put that up there. I know some publishers do that. And finally, why should you get involved? True, there is no obvious cost benefit, but your editors are crying out for help, and I think you can do this. Again, you've got to watch out when your editorial offices go rogue, because you're going to get sucked into that, so you have a stake in this too. And finally, I honestly think we could all save ourselves a lot of time and labour and headaches if we could get some cross-unity on these things, particularly any potential technical solutions down the road that we need. And COPE's doing a wonderful job, so those other organisations are too, but I think publishers can as well. Okay, thank you.